Welcome to our second session of the 2023 to 2024 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host, Tony Mazza, and I'm the Manager of Policy and Research at the Society of American Foresters. The Society of American Foresters, also known as SAF, is the national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the U.S. Founded in 1900, we promote science-based, sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. I want to give a quick thanks to our co-host, Michigan State University's Forest Carbon and Climate Program, or FCCP. FCCP connects diverse forest stakeholders and the broader public with the value of forested lands and forest products in addressing climate change through courses, videos, workshops, as well as other knowledge transfer materials and policy relevant research on forest carbon and harvested wood products. For today's presentation, we'll be hearing from Edie Sonne Hall, founder and principal of 3 Trees Consulting. The title of her discussion today is Forest Sector Carbon Accounting 101, Matching the Question with the Right Framework. Edie has been working on biogenic carbon accounting at all parts of the value chain for over 2 decades. On the product side, Edie has served on ISO standards committees related to LCAs and the first North American wood product category rule. At the organization reporting level, she has participated in the technical working groups for both the product and scope 3 standard, as well as the current draft land and removal guidance of the GHG protocol. And on the forest side, she has commented on numerous offset methodologies, as well as co-authored a VCS-approved IFM methodology. She currently chairs the North American Wood Product LCA Coordination Group, which brings together wood LCA experts, wood building advocates, associations, and academics to better coordinate and efficiently produce wood product LCAs. Finally, she is currently on the technical advisory committees of the UNEP Life Cycle Initiative Biogenic Carbon Project. A big thanks to Edie for joining us today and for this very timely discussion. Just quickly before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please join our mailing list by scanning the QR code on the screen or by emailing forestc@msu.edu or by using the QR code on the screen. A recording of this session, along with a copy of the slides and any supplemental resources, will be posted to the FCCP website in just a few days. Additionally, the presentations today will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. You can use the chat or Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface to submit your questions at any point during the presentations. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible, but of course we have limited time. You can also send questions directly to forestc@msu.edu. Attendees today are qualified to receive CFE credits from SAF. These credits will be automatically applied if you register for the event with the email associated with your SAF account. Similarly, attendees are qualified to receive CEU credits from ISA. For CEU credits, please email forestc@msu.edu with your name and ISA certification number within 7 days of the webinar. With that, I'll be handing it over to Edie to share her screen.
All right. Thank you, Tony. And thanks for outing me that I am a forest and wood product carbon nerd. I think there's no other way I can get around this one. So I am hoping that you will be able to see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, but not full screen yet. There it is.
There it is. Okay, wonderful. And you also forgot to mention that I have chickens. I'm down to 2 right now, but you'll understand why in a second, why that's important. Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm Edie Sonne Hall, and I am really excited to talk to you today. Since this is one of the first webinars of the year, I decided to take a step back and provide some clarification around all of the forest and wood product carbon accounting methods that sometimes seem to contradict each other. So there are two big buckets of confusion I hope to tackle. The first is clarifying the differences between biogenic carbon cycle and fossil fuel, and why we actually do need to understand time and space. And the second is to correctly match up broad carbon accounting frameworks with different types of questions. So I have been working on forest carbon accounting and life cycle assessment issues for well over 20 years, and I can tell you that the confusion is not going away. In fact, some might argue that it's worse because people are more aware of the importance of reducing atmospheric greenhouse gases and want to know how natural climate solutions can help. But if we don't have the right framework with which to assess, we might end up doing more harm than good. So I am going to start off with Biogenic Carbon Cycle 101. And take you on a journey through space and time with hopefully some fun examples. I'm then going to tackle Carbon Accounting 101, and this gets at the heart of understanding what you are trying to answer. Are you reporting a carbon impact? Are you comparing different scenarios? Are you reporting at a country level, which focuses on annual reporting? Product level, which measures impacts over the entire lifetime of a product or service, or organizational, which is a hybrid of the two. We'll then walk through as many examples as we can, recognizing that this is already a full presentation. A warning for you guys, I have a ton of acronyms in this slide, and some of you are going to know the ones that are focused on the wood product side. Some of you are going to know the ones that are focused on the forest side. Likely no one is going to know all of them, so hopefully I will maybe provide a glossary or something with these slides after the fact, but I'm going to kind of breeze through them. Otherwise, we're never going to end this talk. And I know that you are starting fairly well versed, so I'm going to do my best to breeze through the basics. So the first basics, flash review, photosynthesis. This is our joy. Photosynthesis removes CO2 from the atmosphere and stores carbon in the plant cell walls, which make up the wood. And upon combustion or decay, that carbon is re-released back into the atmosphere, and mostly in the form of carbon dioxide. This is a two-way street that can be influenced by both nature and human. To put another way, we can look at carbon in really four major pools: the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, which includes both the vegetation and the soil, and fossil fuel reserves. So as you can see from this graph, the annual gross exchanges, which are here in this net land and this net ocean and the fossil fuels, the land exchanges are huge. This graph, which is a few years old, shows that photosynthesis is on the order of 123 gigatons of carbon, and gross fire and respiration are 119 gigatons of carbon. These fluxes are an order of magnitude more than fossil emissions, which are around 7 to 8 gigatons of carbon. However, it's the net flux that we are interested in. Is more CO2 leaving the atmosphere and going into vegetation, or vice versa? Fossil fuel, on the other hand, is a one-way street. It is a gross emission or a net emission, that's the same thing, and there is no net natural return out of the atmosphere on a time scale that we are interested in. So why am I spending so much time on this? I think we tend to focus so much on either one side or the other. Trees sequester carbon, let's grow trees and they will sequester carbon forever. Or on the other hand, trees burn and emit carbon, or we harvest and emit carbon, and these are emissions. But we often don't focus on the interconnectedness between the two. So you could remove trees, and maybe when a fire comes through, they don't burn as much. Or we clear cut, and that resets the growth trajectory of the future stand. So they're all related. And at the end of the day, what we care about is what the atmosphere sees. So another big source of complexity is the inherent nature of this amazing biological process. It is impacted by both natural and human influences. There are attempts to separate the two, which the IPCC notes is extremely difficult to do, leading to roughly 10 pages in the latest IPCC Working Group 3 report discussing different approaches and vast differences in the results. So you might hear the term or the saying that the land sector accounts to 13 to 21% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So let's see where this number comes from. In this chart right here, there are about 5.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide, or 14% of total greenhouse or CO2 emissions, that are attributed to the anthropogenic emissions from a particular model. These are based on global carbon and bookkeeping models, which, quote, only include direct human impacts, such as land use change and those lands subject to intense and direct management, such as clear-cut harvest. On the right column here, the natural response, which includes everything else, is a gross sink on the order of 12.5 gigatons of CO2, making the net a gross sink of 6.6 gigatons of CO2. Now, national greenhouse gas inventories, so these are the countries that report to the UNFCCC every year, the presentation that Grant did last month, they take a different approach by applying something called the managed land proxy. And the managed land proxy basically includes all the emissions and removals that come from lands where, quote, human interventions and practices have been applied to perform production, ecological, or social functions. When you use this approach, the net anthropogenic emissions are closer to zero. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what method is used as long as you know what the assumptions are and they are explicit and that the applications are consistent. What happens is that people take one approach and the assumptions get lost, like in a game of telephone. So here's an example that illustrates both the gross versus the net and the natural versus anthropogenic conundrums. At the top left, this is a headline that caused a lot of confusion about 5 years ago in the state of Oregon. The graph on the right depicts the forest sector as a source of emissions, leading to the headline that timber is Oregon's biggest carbon polluter. And this didn't jive with any of the FIA data, which shows that Oregon forests are actually a net carbon sink. So now at the bottom left is the source of the graph on the right, with a key difference in the labeling. Okay, so the numbers kind of are all the same, it's just a difference in the labeling. So the forest, the net ecosystem carbon budget, which is this piece on the left here, is basically the sum of all of the fluxes, the gross fluxes that happen in the state of Oregon, which includes the gross productivity minus respiration, minus harvest removals, and minus fire. The forest sector bar on the right is just the sum of harvest and fire emissions. The growth of the trees are not included. So this is an example of looking at the gross versus net fluxes. This is also an extreme version of saying that the anthropogenic is the activity of harvesting and nature is the natural response of the regrowth of the tree. Now, never mind the fact that the growth represents trees that actually were replanted in prior years based on past harvest. And in the state of Oregon, you have to replant after harvest. So here's another way to look at it. The circle in red represents the plot that was harvested this year to supply a mill. That is carbon that is coming off the landscape in this year. But in the same year, all the other trees around it are growing. Now, some of them are growing quite fast because they might have been harvested, in years past, and now they are in their super sequestration phase. Some of the mills will be sourcing from those lands in the coming years. Some of these circles might never be harvested because a landscape requires a patchwork of different functions. So in any given year, it's the net impact of the carbon in the land that we care about. This becomes especially important when we have different ownerships. You might think you want to know about the carbon balance of a particular landowner you are sourcing from. But what if all of these circles represented different small landowners? Do you only care about the landowner in the red circle? That won't tell you what the atmosphere sees. Ownership size shouldn't matter because you still need to do the analysis at the landscape level. That's the reality when you have a system with a rotation age longer than 1 year, like forests. Which leads me to explaining why Portlandia chickens and wood fiber don't have anything to do with each other. So for those of you who are familiar with the series of Portlandia, there was a famous episode where Fred and Carrie are in a restaurant and they order chicken and they're asking for the credentials of the chicken, meaning its name and where it lived and what are its hobbies and what were its food sources. And they end up not being satisfied with the waitress's answer, and they have to go to the farm where that chicken grew up. And then they end up living there for like 5 years in some sort of cult thing. So if we were to apply this to our trees, we would be making sure that our tree that we have just purchased is doing all the things, or was doing all the things that a tree is supposed to do. Sequester carbon, provide habitat for all species, provide shade for water, prevent erosion, nurture mushrooms, etc. The reality is that one tree can never provide all these things every year indefinitely. In the early years, provide habitat for the early successional species, those deer and elk and birds that love to browse in clear cuts and then go back to the forest for shelter. And then its canopy closes and a different set of plants and animals like it. As it reaches maturity, a different set moves in. And so as this graph shows, carbon stocks and forests are always in flux due to variations in age, disturbance, and environmental factors. Detecting patterns and trends require a broad view in both space and time. Harvesting, which happens on only 1 to 3% of the landscape per year in the United States, depending on the region and growth rates, is just one activity that spurs a reset of growth in future years. So to date, we've been talking about just the forest and atmosphere interactions. However, the forest sector is not just the impact between the land and the atmosphere, but also how the forest sector and its products impacts fossil fuel emissions. So in fact, the latest IPCC mitigation report created this chart that shows that the land sector impacts almost every other sector: the built environment, transportation, energy, industry, even urban areas. So how do we fully measure the impact of the forest sector on the atmosphere? So this is a picture of the main sets of emissions and sequestration, also known as removals, in the forest supply chain. The forest carbon flux can either be a net source or a sink, depending on whether carbon stocks are increasing or decreasing. Now, in manufacturing, you have a mix of both fossil and biogenic emissions. You have this in transportation, in the product processing, as well as transportation to the final consumption. There's also carbon that's stored in the wood product. We still have the complexities associated with time and space, especially when we try to combine all three sets of these carbon impacts. For example, if you report harvest as an emission on the landscape, either through net stock change or gain loss, you have already accounted for the emissions, for the biogenic emissions associated with manufacturing and end of life. So the only thing that you would be reporting would be the long-term storage of the carbon in the wood product, either at a set time horizon, for example, 100 years, or permanently, which would be the carbon that's permanently stored in a landfill. In addition, forest flux of a wood product LCA has traditionally been very difficult to combine with a wood product LCA. And this is partly because life cycle assessment is a mass balance equation and does not do well with things that are dynamic over space and time, like the forest cycle. And especially when you add how that relates to the other ecosystem services that forests provide. But if you're going to do it with carbon, it's that net forest carbon flux. And if you are going to do that, if that carbon flux is a removal, so you're gaining in carbon stocks, you technically also need to assess the risk that this removal will remain over the same time horizon as the wood product. So this is not something that is currently practiced, as most LCAs currently do not include removals from the forest. The manufacturing emissions are governed by ISO standards related to life cycle assessment, as well as product category rules that dictate the consumer-facing report of an attributional LCA, otherwise known as an EPD or an environmental product declaration. Here's where I'm going to be losing half of you, and here's where half of you might be hitting your wheelhouse. So I'm showing this not to completely overwhelm you, but to provide a little bit of context. There are a ton of nuances to LCA, which I will get into next at a very simplistic and high level. If you can take away anything, it's the key to an LCA is to first state your goal. What question are you trying to answer? So what are you trying to answer? This chart breaks down two types of life cycle assessments. The first uses something called attributional methods, where you are measuring the actual impact of a product or service. This is also called inventory reporting. You would use this for national inventories, for product LCAs to make an environmental product declaration, for corporate inventories, and the general bucket of carbon footprints. The second LCA methodology is called consequential LCA, which is looking at the marginal impact of producing more or less of a product or service. So this falls into the category of intervention accounting or comparing against a counterfactual. This is appropriate for offsets, so the project accounting level, for policy analyses, or for scenario comparison. I will have you note that when you use consequential LCA, you inherently bring in, you mostly bring in modeling, which brings in a ton of assumptions. As we know, all models are wrong and some models are useful. Where is my, oh, I lose my, lost my, oh, here it is. Okay. There we go. Okay. Another element to consider is time. So even among inventory accounting frameworks, there are different time frames of reporting. So countries report their emissions and removals on an annual timescale. Product life cycle assessments are reporting the emissions and removals over the life cycle of a product or a service, or from cradle to grave. This means that the emissions or removals are not actually occurring in this particular year, but they will occur or may have already occurred based on making this product or service. Organizational or company reporting is a hybrid of the two. Your scope 1 emissions are annual. They occur in this year. And your scope 3 emissions are a mix of annual and life cycle. Some may have already occurred, some are occurring now, and some may occur in the future. I'm going to go into this a little more on the next slide. Okay, so just to give examples of what we mean when we say scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 are the direct emissions of your company. Scope 2 is the purchased electricity of the company, and scope 3 includes everything else in the value chain. So some of these upstream emissions may have occurred in years past. These could be your purchased goods or your capital goods. Some may be occurring in this year, such as your business travel or your employer commuting. But some may occur in future years. So these are maybe further processing of the product that you have made, or the use of your sold product, or even the end-of-life treatment of your sold product. These different frameworks serve very different purposes. And so it's important to understand that they are not going to be able to add up to each other or be compared to each other. So for example, a company's corporate inventory will not jive completely with country level reporting. Okay, so now we're going to walk through some examples to see if we can match the framework and the parameters with the right question. Let's see how much time I have. Okay, first one. This should be the easy one, right? I want to calculate the carbon in my forest offset project. Okay, so this is the one that's probably the most familiar to you. You are intending to compare against a counterfactual of what would have happened without the offset project. So this is definitely intervention accounting. Since you are balancing an emission, balancing this offset against an emission, your time frame needs to be long enough to adhere to the permanence principle. And that is decided based on different protocols, usually somewhere around 100 years. Finally, again, because you are balancing against an emission somewhere else, you need to consider leakage as well as additionality. The goal is to create a ton of truly additional reduction in the atmosphere. So there's been a lot of attention and work given to the difficulties in creating that counterfactual for an offset project. If you are using a model, you are inherently using a lot of assumptions, which may or may not be reflective of what the atmosphere sees. Well, you're trying to do your best. Okay, example number 2. I want to know the carbon impact of the wood I am buying. This is a product that has already been produced, and it would be quantified through attributional or impact inventory accounting. Product LCAs have a long time frame. They're either cradle to grave or cradle to gate or over a specified time horizon, such as 100 years. As I mentioned before, the forest side is really hard to include, but if you do include it as a removal, you should consider the risk of reversal in the forest of that removal over the same specified time horizon as the product. Example number 3. I should like hide these and see if you can get them now. I want to report my company's greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So we've already gone over this for reporting. This is inventory, and the time frame is a mix of annual and life cycle. But it's important to note that a company's target setting, so that is, setting a goal for reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, might include some consequential analyses. This will help understand how that company can improve beyond their current trajectory. Now, however, again, when you're introducing modeling and assumptions, your uncertainty skyrockets. So proceed with caution. Example number 4. I want to compare a wood building versus a concrete building. This one's kind of a trick question. Because your choice of accounting actually depends on whether you're making a comparison as a consumer or in a policy. So why does this differ? So in one, you assume, if in the first one, you're assuming that both buildings will be made, and you're just comparing the impacts of each one. But in a policy, you're assuming that you're going to impact the demand for one type of over another. So either more wood or more concrete buildings will be made relative to their current market share. And that's when the consequential analysis comes into effect. Okay, finally, example number 5. I want to know what will happen if we either increase or decrease demand for wood. Now, this is a scenario analysis that would be consequential analysis that would include the impacts on both the forest side as well as the substitution impacts of various product mixes. So if you are reducing harvest, you are potentially using other alternative materials instead of the wood products that are made. Likewise, if you increase demand for wood products, you would be impacting the impact on the forest and vice versa. So in this one, you can choose your time horizon, but the longer the time horizon you choose, the fuller picture you're going to get. These types of analyses are very complicated, and they're very context specific, and again, will be very dependent on the assumptions of the models. However, sometimes it's helpful to look at past empirical data to understand feedback, especially as it's related to feedback in the forest side. Okay. I have managed to sneak in about every possible acronym and every forest sector accounting consideration. And honestly, I have only scratched the surface. I haven't even addressed temporary storage or the differences between an inset and an offset, or why people feel the need to separate avoided emissions and removals. But if you can take away anything from this talk, it's that it is okay that there are different accounting methods out there. However, they are not just a simple menu option. You can't just pick one off the shelf and apply it willy-nilly. That the different ones get matched to different questions. So just as you need the right equipment for summiting a mountain, you need to apply the right methodology to answer your questions. And I am going to stop now and open it up to some questions. Oh, I've got some time. All right, that's unlike me.
Edie, thank you so much. A really great presentation. So with our remaining time, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. We've been monitoring the chat, which is empty at the moment. Please don't be shy. And moving forward, you can submit your questions through the chat box or through the Q&A. I will be monitoring both. Since we don't have any questions at the moment, I will jump in with my own question, Edie, which is that you made it clear that to create and study these sustainable supply chains, you need relationships between people like builders, architects, fabricators, and foresters. So I was wondering if you've done any of the work to connect these fields, or if you know of any initiatives or organizations working to connect these different supply chain officers.
That's a great question. So the answer is, I would say there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but yes, there's work happening. So first, why there's a lot that needs to be done. So one of the really important things associated with the forest sector is that there are a whole bunch of different players in the forest sector. So on the land side, you in and of itself, you have many different operators. You've got the small landowners, you've got the large landowners, you've got tribal lands, you've got state lands, you've got government lands. All are managing a lot of times right around each other and for different objectives, but are feeding a different set of players in the supply chain, which are the mills. And the mills are also equally diverse and equally varied. So they are using their own specific parts of the tree. So you've got some of the mills that are taking the low value material, the pulpwood, the residuals you have, and they're making paper or energy or gluing together small things and making MDF or OSB. And then you have the mills that are focused on that good high quality saw timber. You have engineered facilities. All of those are different players, and they're different companies, even different organizations. And then on the consumer side, you have a whole new set of players. And within, like, even you mentioned the builder supply chain, you have like 3 different layers to get from the mill manufacturer to the builder. And that includes the architect, the designer and engineer, the builders, the GMs, all of the players. They might also be not necessarily talking to each other or talking directly to the mill place. So I think in the course of all of this, especially as it's related to carbon, what happens is that final consumer wants to know what's happening on the land. They actually are that Portlandia person. They want to know. They want to know where that wood came from, and are the birds happy, and are the flowers happy. And it's really hard because, it's hard to like walk the way through the translation of it. So because of that, there has been an effort among all of the folks that I just mentioned, all the landowners, the manufacturers, even the architects and engineers, the USDA and US Forest Service, to say, hey, we need to come together and we need to figure out how we can communicate this story in a more coherent way. So there's an effort that's coming out. That builds together a forest and wood product carbon platform that is built off of the USDA entity level guidelines that hopefully is going to be coming down the pike soon. A U.S. endowment is leading the effort, but a lot of different organizations are involved in this effort that hopefully will make things a lot more transparent and a lot clearer and less confusing.
Yeah, it's a difficult story to tell, but great answer. Thank you. Okay, so we have another great question from Andy. We have a slew of questions that came in right as I said, please throw them in the chat. So we have a long list now. Yeah. So Andy asks, how would one monetize the carbon stored in wood products as part of an offset program?
Ooh, okay. So again, let's match the question to the framework. You said offset program. So an offset program, we have to adhere to the principles of offsets, which we are trying to ensure that an actual change in the atmosphere is occurring beyond business as usual. So we do have to adhere to that principle of additionality. So there are a couple ways that carbon in the wood product. First of all, in any offset project that you're talking about, you should be including the carbon in the wood product in both your baseline and your project, because it is part, if you're harvesting, it is part of that carbon pool, just like the forest is. But what you're trying to say is, how can we get credit for maybe increasing the carbon that's in that wood product? And I would say that principally they're like two kind of not hypothetical, but two strategies that you might do that. One is making more wood product from the same amount of material. So that's like a mill increasing their yield factor, becoming more efficient in taking the wood that's coming in and producing the product that's coming out. The second one, which is actually one that is trying to get some offset methodologies developed in the voluntary carbon market, is in that consumer choice of especially related to building products. So the way that you would have to design that is to be looking at changing the market share of a particular building and putting more carbon, is otherwise known as embedded carbon, in a building relative to its general use, so its common practice, or also comparing the manufacturing emissions. So that's what's known as the embodied carbon. So the key on that one is, like, you likely are not going to get carbon credits for building a residential home out of wood, because we already do that here in the US. Not in other countries, but we do them in the US. But there are lots of building types that could be built with wood that are not currently right now. And so it's those places that you would be focused on. I don't know if that helps or not.
No, that's great. Thank you, Edie. Okay, so the next question, it was actually the first question, but I wanted to save it because it's challenging. Mike asks, is it helpful or harmful for foresters to claim that harvested wood products are carbon neutral?
Well, so I don't like any de facto, actually, a lot of times people say assume, which is a slightly different. I don't like anything that says assume, because I don't assume anything. I think it's really important to be assessing the context with which you are making your claim. So harvested wood products are carbon neutral is a very, in my head, a very ambiguous term. Sometimes they're referring to the emissions associated with manufacturing it. And in that one, again, you should not assume that. The key is that it depends on where you're accounting for it. And most of the time you're accounting for it on the land side. So if you also report it on the manufacturing side, you're double counting. There are claims, but again, it really depends on the wood product. But when you look at the long-term storage in the wood product, and you also look at the emissions associated with growing, manufacturing, transporting, and you add the two together, kind of like that full carbon footprint, depending on the product, you can have the situation where there's more carbon stored in the product than all of the emissions. So that maybe is sort of the claim that people might be referring to. But again, it's not for everything. So the key, I would say, is to be more specific about whatever claim you are trying to make.
Great. Thank you, Edie. Um, Tanishri asks, can you go over the Oregon example again? Why is it that the forest is showing net negative versus the graph on the left?
Okay.
Yeah,
Let
maybe
me
we
see.
can scroll back in the presentation there.
Yeah. Let's see here. Early. I'm so glad I left time for questions because I knew these are good. Okay. So the question is, why is it that the forests show a net negative when, what was the question?
Versus the graph on the left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. Can you guys, I don't know if you can see this graph. I'm hoping you can, but I'm going to focus on the table on the right. So the table on the right and the graph on, sorry, table on the left and the graph on the right are both from the same article, the same article, the Law and Harmon article in 2018, which has a methodology that is carefully and explicitly applied here. So the table on the left has net primary productivity, which is your gross kind of photosynthesis. And then respiration is your, what just the natural processes associated with growing a tree. And then the net ecosystem productivity is kind of that net growth. But then in the state of Oregon, there are harvest removals and fire emissions. So the net ecosystem carbon budget, this number 18.15 on the left, is the sum of all of those. That's the net change on the landscape, according to this model. Now, you might be confused because this says 18, and then when you go to the right, these are larger numbers. They're in the 50, because the left one is carbon and the right one is CO2. It messes everybody up, but those are the conversion factors. So this net ecosystem carbon budget is expressed in terms of CO2. The forest sector down here is just simply the sum of the fire and the harvest. So those are just the gross emissions. So when you looked at this and when you said that timber, this is a separate journal article that was based on this study. It says timber is Oregon's largest carbon polluter. That only takes into account the emissions associated with harvesting and fire, and does not take into account any growth of the trees that are around it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that last part was very clear. Right. Great. So we have so many questions. I wish we had another half hour, but I will try to condense some of them. A lot of them have overlapping themes. So we'll start with a quick one. Sandra asks, is there any quality resources or trainings you'd recommend for people who want to take a deeper dive into carbon accounting?
Well, Michigan State has a couple short carbon courses, short and long, that dive into a lot of these different topics in more detail. Anna, I'm hoping that you can perhaps provide some more information about that, but I would say that they are a good starting point. And again, it really does depend on, I have thrown in a zillion different types of accounting and types of the forest sector that usually are not combined together. So there isn't really a one-stop shop that's highly detailed, although we are trying to get better about that and work on it. But I think Michigan State's the place to start.
Great. Yeah, and Sandra and others, Anna just added that link in the chat. You can see it there. Okay, so this next question is more of an amalgamation of a couple different questions, which starts out with the idea that some carbon offset companies have had allegations put against them that some of their offsets don't actually exist. And other people within the Q&A are asking about how to think about the concept of time, or how to value time within carbon offsets, whether it be for the offsets themselves or for harvest deferral. I wonder if you could touch on those two aspects of carbon offsets.
I think there are like 3 different questions in there.
You're welcome.
But yes, I think, this is the tricky thing. So there is criticism and some offsets that there's questioning whether the project itself is truly additional. So whether it actually changed activity and actually changed the atmosphere. And I do think, I'm glad you honed in on the time thing. I do think that that's an important piece, because sometimes that change may not occur in the current year or in the early years, but maybe impacting future years. And that's where you sort of have that length of time that you are committing to doing something. But nevertheless, I think this is the real complexity associated with offset projects, with consequential analyses, is at the end of the day, it is dependent on what those assumptions may be associated with your baseline. So the more you can move away from a modeled baseline, the more that you might be able to try to hone in on some of those two changes. The thing about deferred harvest, you might be getting at, there are 2 sort of themes associated with that. One, just making sure that leakage is accounted for. I think that's a really important thing. So leakage is a sense of, if you are deferring a harvest in one area, are you just spurring harvest somewhere else? And if you're not spurring harvest somewhere else, are you causing leakage to a different material? So there's kind of 2 types of leakage there. And then finally, I thought I heard the mention of time. I don't know if this is one of the things that I didn't tackle, was the idea of temporary storage, which I think is an important piece to consider. So this is the idea that even if you hold a carbon, if you store carbon for a small length of time, you still are impacting through radiative forcing. You're still impacting, having a positive impact on the atmosphere. And the question is how you calculate that. And there are methods to do it. There are also methods to do it incorrectly. And so it's caused a lot of confusion. But there is a benefit of keeping something even temporarily stored.
Great. Thank you, Edie. Okay, so I think we have time for just one more question, maybe 2, depending on how long this one lasts. This is a question from Matt Russell, one that I've also had. What's your sense for the future of carbon accounting within urban forests? With new funding available in the urban space, it seems like carbon accounting methods are less well developed.
That's a great question. There is, Tony, is it out yet? Our urban position statement, or urban forest position statement?
Oh, the updated position statement. Danielle, is that out yet? Are you online, Danielle?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Soon to be.
Yeah.
Soon to be out. Bottom line is that urban forests are super duper important, not just for carbon, but for a whole bunch of different things. And so I think it is a wise thing and hopefully beneficial thing to do, to figure out more ways to incentivize good, efficient, healthy, productive, resilient management of urban forests, just like we do with the rest of our forests.
Great, thanks, Edie. Okay, so we're just about at time. I think we should call it here. So I'd just like to thank you again, Edie, for a great presentation, one that's very timely. Pleasure to hear from you on this, very informative. And if you want to reach out to Edie with any further questions, there are a ton left in the chat I think you might have interest in answering. And Again, the webinar recording and the slides will be posted within just a few days. To be included on our mailing list and to receive registration details and other information regarding upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu. And stay tuned for the full 2023 to 24 lineup flyer, which will be announced very soon. With that, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.